Whoops. Let's remember that, before we get to that, let's remember that what does I stand for? It's an imaginary number, and it represents the square root of a -1. So if we were to square both sides, we would get I squared, and what would I square equal? -1. So anytime we see the term I squared, we can substitute a -1 in for it. So let's remember that when we're working with 5i that we want to square. So we want to square the term 5i. So that involves squaring both the 5 and the I. So 5 squared, 25. I squared, we said, is -1. So 5i squared is a -25. That we want to square. We have I radical 2. And we want to square that. So you're putting this in your notes, right?
Yes.
So I radical 2, we want to square that. So when we square a product, we have to square each factor or each term in the product. So we're going to square the I, and we're going to square the square root of 2. Okay, so the square root of I squared is just I squared. We'll substitute here shortly. When we square a square root, those cancel each other out. They nullify each other. So we should just get 2 here. Another way to look at that, when we take the square root of 2 and square it, that gives us, you're multiplying by itself, that gives us the square root of 4, and the square root of 4 we know is 2. So couple different ways to look at that. We know that I squared is -1 times 2 gives us a -2. Okay, now we want to square a -2i. So that's going to involve this. That's what that looks like. We're going to square each factor individually. We could separate the -1 times the 2, or we can just put the -2 together and square that. And then we're going to square the I. So a -2 squared, if you don't put it in parentheses on your calculator, it's going to tell you your answer is a -4. That's not true. We are squaring both the negative and the 2 in this case. So a -2 squared would be a -2 times a -2, which is 4. And then I squared is a -1. That gives you a -4. Then the last one, maybe the last one, not the last one. This one, we are going to square the whole thing. So radical 3 over 3i squared. We're going to break that down into the fraction that we're squaring, and then the imaginary number, we're just going to write it as I squared because we know that's what we're doing, right? We're squaring I to get I squared. Okay, so when we square a fraction, we square both the numerator and the denominator. So long way around this would be we're going to square the square root of 3, and then we're going to square 3 in the denominator. That's supposed to be squared. And then we know I squared is a -1, right? So squaring a square root, they cancel each other out, or you could say the square root of 3 squared is the square root of 9, which is 3. So in the numerator, we're going to get 3. 3 squared in the denominator is going to give you 9 times a negative 1. And we can reduce that 3/9 to 1/3 times a negative 1, which will give us a negative 1/3. Okay, so we are again wanting to square this. That's what the instruction said above. So that means I'm going to take all of this and square it, but I'm going to break it down into the negative 6, the I, and then the square root of 6. Now you may be able to do this in your head, and that's okay. But just in case, I'm going to spell it all out for you so that you can understand where everything's coming from. So again, negative 6, we're squaring that whole term. So negative 6 times a negative 6 would be 36. I squared, we can substitute a negative 1 in for that. And then the square root of 6 squared would be the square root of 36, which is 6. So now I can combine, I can just multiply. 36 times a negative 1 would be a negative 36. And then take that times 6 would be a negative 216. So squaring a square root should get rid of the square root. Squaring I should also get rid of I, which will be helpful when we want to, just like we can't leave a square root in the denominator of a fraction, we cannot leave I in the denominator of a fraction. So it's going to be helpful for us to know how to do square or multiply i's. Okay, so your assignment's going to be a worksheet. It's going to take into account the 3 things we've done already. We've graphed quadratic equations. We solved by graphing. We're going to solve by taking the square root, and then you're going to find the square of each imaginary number. So let's look at what that is going to be. Go to your homework log, and you can write this down. It's 2 sides. So the first side says lesson 3-1 A/B, and the back side has C. You will not do number 2 on both sides because that's by factoring, and we haven't talked about that just yet. And then the ones, there's some word problems below. I want you to give those a shot. I'm not going to count off for those, but I want you to try those. So the 2 word problems below 10 and 11, extra, but do them. Okay, give them a try.
If we think we can do the 2.
The factoring, if you can, yeah, if you think you can do 2, we haven't covered it yet, but you're more than welcome to. So this is due tomorrow, and I will hand those out for you.